Hello and welcome to Looking Through Luke, a YouTube series where we systematically work through one of the ancient biographies of Jesus known as the Gospel of Luke. My name is James and I'm so glad that you've found us. Whether you're a skeptic, a curious onlooker, or indeed a follower of Jesus, my hope is that together we would have a clearer view of who Jesus is, the claims that he made and what he did, and that along the way we might even meet Jesus himself. Feel free to ask questions or comment below as we learn together. I'm so glad that you're here, so let's jump into our next episode. Welcome to Looking Through Luke. I'm really excited today. I'm also freezing cold. It's the coldest day we've had this year here in Launceston, Tasmania, and we're inching closer to winter, and it turns out that the heater doesn't work. So I'm cold, but I'm also really excited because we've moved out of chapter 1 of Luke's Gospel, of the biography of Jesus written by Luke, and we're into chapter 2. And with chapter 2 comes the birth of Jesus. So let's jump in. I'm going to read the first few verses of chapter 2, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time together unpacking them. So it says this: in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. Well, if you've ever heard anything of the story of Jesus, it's likely that you've heard the narrative of his birth at Christmas. It's not Christmas today, it's the middle of May, but we're up to chapter 2, and as we dive into it, I want us to keep in mind, remember the purpose for which Luke is writing, and my hope, the purpose for which you and I are listening and engaging with this. Luke writes to Theophilus saying, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught. And that's what's going on here, is Luke gives us details to the birth of Jesus. The first thing he does is ground it in the historical context of what's happening in human history, because he wants Theophilus and all those who read it to know that this is an event that takes place in the realm of human history. And that's really helpful for us thousands of years later as we go and look at the text and try and make sense of it. Well, Luke tells us that in those days, it's just a colloquial expression, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should take place in the entire Roman world. Now, the entire Roman world is just a sweeping statement to say that this is something that impacted everybody. So we read that in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Well, there's a couple of colloquial expressions there. In those days, Luke just writes, at that time, and in the entire Roman world was just a sweeping general statement to say this impacted everybody. But what's important is that it occurs at the time of Caesar Augustus. Now, for those historians watching amongst us, Caesar Augustus was, of course, Octavian. Octavian was born in 63 BC, and he, alongside Mark Antony and Lepidus, was part of the triumvirate to rule and govern the Roman Empire. He was the great nephew of Julius Caesar. And without going into all that happened, eventually Octavius became sole ruler, emperor, Caesar of the Roman Empire in 27 BC. And Octavius was given the honoured Greek name Sebastus, which we translate as Augustus. So he became Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus was a great administrator. In fact, we know in non-biblical sources, perhaps the greatest or most well-known of the ancient Roman historians, Tacitus, he records in his annals of at least 3 occasions where Caesar Augustus, where Octavian conducts censuses. He does one in Gaul, which is now mostly what we know as modern-day France. He does one in Cyrene in Libya, and he does one in Egypt. Well, Luke wants us to know that he's issued a decree that a census take place. And he gives us a little note that it's the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, Quirinius, another historical figure, had a distinguished career as an administrator, and he was a notable soldier. He was appointed consul in 12 BC, and he was effectively the governor of Syria from 6 to 9 AD. So there's a little note here that says while Quirinius was governor of Syria. It doesn't necessarily mean literally whilst he was in that office in the present time, but it certainly points to his, if you will, governmental or administrative career. And we read that it was the first census that took place under Quirinius. In fact, it's likely that there were at least 2. We know that the second one happened in 6 AD. So this is likely the first census. It happens before 6 AD. And we read that everyone went to their own town to register. Now that's slightly unusual, that people would travel back to their own place of birth to register. But again, it's not unprecedented. So there's records of people travelling to different districts or different areas across the Roman Empire where they owned property, etc. And there's some suggestion amongst scholars that actually this, for Rome to issue an edict that a census is going to take place in Judea is a very inconvenient thing. It's not a popular decision when you're being occupied for your oppressor to demand that you partake in a census. And so there's some conjecture that this was actually the easiest way for Rome to do it because it played into Jewish customs and Jewish traditions, and so getting people to go back to their place of birth fit in with Jewish traditions. And this census takes place ostensibly for the purposes of registration for paying taxes. People complain about paying taxes now. Well, I'm sure people were complaining about paying taxes 2,000 years ago. What's that old adage? There are only 2 certain things in life, death and taxes. Well, Joseph, we read, goes up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee, where he lived, to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David. Why? Well, we read because he belonged to the house and line of David. So what Luke does is he wants to place the birth of Jesus in the historical context. It happens in the context of a ruling Roman Empire whilst Caesar Augustus is on the throne, while Quirinius is a council administrator in Syria. Luke also wants to place the birth in the context of Joseph's Jewish ancestry. He makes it clear of the lineage, the link to King David, that Joseph is part of the Davidic line. Why does that matter? Well, because as we've seen, the Messiah would come from the house of David. And so Luke wants us to know that when Jesus is born, he's being born into the line of David. It's a working out of what was prophesied, that Jesus has kingly ancestry, that he fits the the descriptions of the prophecies around the birth of the Messiah. Now, the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, it was about 145 kilometres. And we read that he goes there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and expecting a child. Now, when we read was pledged to be married to him, we might think they're still engaged or betrothed. But I think this is Luke's way of saying they're married, but it's Luke's way of saying that they haven't yet consummated their marriage. Mary's still a virgin. She's expecting, she's carrying a child. They travel together. She's obviously heavily pregnant, but they haven't yet consummated their marriage. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. We read, she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. Well, that's all the information that Luke gives about the specific details and activity of the birth of Jesus and his family of Mary and Joseph. And so there's a few things there that we know, right? He's placed in a manger. He's placed in a food trough. When Jesus is born, he's born in a room that houses animals. He's wrapped in cloth, swaddling, strips of cloth that were often bound around a child to keep their arms and legs straight and secure. And he's placed in a food trough. And we read there's no guest room available for them. And we hear that, and then in our modern traditions, we jump straight to the nativity scene, don't we? I've got a gorgeous little nativity scene that I enjoy setting up with my kids every Christmas. It's got the stable, it's got the trough, it's got the shepherds, and there's no room at the inn, right? Well, a lot of that is relatively modern in terms of our thinking and understanding, and probably not true to what literally took place. Certainly not according to the information that Luke gives us. What we do know is that Jesus is born in a place where animals are likely housed, and there is no room in the guest room. And most people think what that means is that it's not that when Joseph and Mary came to town they couldn't find a place at the local Best and Western, and so the innkeeper stuck them up in a stable next door. It's likely that they had friends or relatives that they went to stay with, and because people were gathering for the census, the guest room in the house that was reserved for friends and family travelling through was already taken. And so the only room available in this private residence was the place where the animals were kept, either a stable or perhaps just as likely a cave. And so there isn't this sense of Mary and Joseph being in abject poverty. There isn't a sense of an innkeeper turning them away. It's just that they went to stay with their friends or their relatives most likely, and others were already staying there. And so the owner of the house, wanting to show hospitality and needing to show hospitality, offered the place that was still available in their house, which would have been a place where they kept animals. The whole point of that, of course, is to show and demonstrate the humble birth of Jesus. So Luke shows us that Jesus's birth is of humble origin. It's a very humble birth. It's not the kind of birth you'd expect from someone who Luke will go on to say is the most significant person in human history. These days you have celebrity babies being born, and there's bidding wars from magazines as people sell the rights to photos, and you get big write-ups in magazines. I'm not up to date with celebrity births, but I can't help but contrast the birth of what Luke says is someone of royal descent, Jesus, from the line of David, with the birth of other royals. When Prince William was born in 1982, there in the private wing of the hospital with Prince Charles and Princess Diana. The birth took place, and there's this iconic moment, this video of Princess Di and Prince Charles coming out onto the steps of the hospital with Prince William wrapped in cloth, and you can hear the cheers of hundreds of even thousands of people as this baby is introduced to the world. They have the private wing of the hospital. They had the Queen's private medical professionals on standby, involved. It was, you can imagine, it's quite an event, and the tabloids splashed across the world. The birth of the heir apparent, Prince William. Well, no such news at the birth of Jesus. Very humble and almost nondescript. Not the kind of birth you'd expect of a king, not the kind of birth you'd expect of a Messiah. So Jesus' birth occurs in very humble circumstances. Luke is placing Jesus' birth in the context of world history. When we join together next week, we're going to see heaven's reaction. But the big point that I want to draw out in this, other than the fact that Luke goes to length to show that this is a historical moment, that this happens, it literally happens in the context of human history, which is important because you get people today going, oh, did Jesus even exist? Was he even real? And it's really interesting how people often accept ancient history, say, for example, the reign of Julius Caesar as Roman emperor, on the basis of what amounts to be quite a small amount of remaining evidence, and yet accept that just because it seems to be a given, and yet when it comes to the birth of Jesus and the life of Jesus, dismiss it as a myth or legend, when in fact there's great evidence. Historical ancient evidence suggests that it took place. So Luke wants us to see that it really happened. Luke also wants us and his readers to know and to see now that it occurs in the line of David, that Jesus is part of that Jesus is of royal ancestry, that he's connected through the line of King David. And that's really important later on as we think about, well, what does it mean that Jesus claims to be the Messiah? And what was the Messiah going to be like? And what could we know about the Messiah? But the other thing I really want us to take away just today as we look at the birth of Jesus is this idea that seemingly accidental events of history become in themselves acts of destiny. That with a flourish of the pen, Caesar Augustus can issue a census, and in doing so, the parents of a baby are relocated from Nazareth to Bethlehem, 140 kilometres to the south, and find themselves exactly where they need to be in order for prophecies to be fulfilled. Little actions can have great significance. Many of you would be familiar with the butterfly effect. In fact, I was talking to Matthew just before testing him to see if he knew. Matthew's our editor, he's behind the camera in all these events. And he was telling me, look, the butterfly effect is when you have these little seemingly insignificant moments or actions that cascade into causing something of great significance. And so many people today put that down to chance, put it down to random events. But Luke wants us to see, as we've seen in chapter 1 with the birth of John to Zechariah and Elizabeth, so too God is behind the scenes, pulling together, guiding the events of history in order for this to take place as God has determined. And whether it's an emperor in Rome or a country family in Palestine, God is in control, and God is orchestrating things to ensure that his purposes and plans come to pass. I'm tempted to look at my life sometimes and just to see it as a series of random events with no rhyme or reason. But one of the things that gives me great confidence and hope in my life as I seek to live it well is the idea that the same God who was at work 2,000 years ago, pulling together the events of history and orchestrating the birth of Jesus, is the same God who's at work in the world today. And you look at the world today and you see the mess that it's in, and I'm tempted to wonder, is there any hope? Sometimes I look at the mess of my own life as I struggle with depression and other things at different times. And I think, is there any hope? And yet I can trust, even just in the first couple of chapters of Luke, as he writes to persuade us of the certainty of what he's writing, that it's true. I could see a God whose hand is at work, sometimes front and center as angels appear and deliver messages, sometimes behind the scenes as an emperor, with a flourish of the pen, gives an edict for a census to affect a family thousands of kilometers away. I can trust that that same God is at work today. So we're going to continue next time with the second part of Jesus' birth story and look at heaven's reaction. In the meantime, let me encourage you to, if you're a praying person, to pray to God and thank Him for His sovereignty, that is His rule and reign in the world, and to trust that He's at work producing and bringing about good things even if we can't see them. And if you're not a praying person, I wonder if you'd want to look back over your life and see if you can see threads that are bringing your life together, that have led to where you are now, and to ponder whether or not that is chance and accident, or whether in fact there's something behind it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for looking through Luke. Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to make a comment below. And if you did find the video helpful or interesting, please hit the thumbs up and give us a like, and click the bell notification and subscribe. It really helps us get these videos out to a wider audience. We're not trying to build a massive following or channel. We are simply trying to communicate the truth of who Jesus is from the Bible. So if that's something that you can get behind,